Stop right there. That move. Where did you learn that? The girl paused mid-turn, her arms still raised, her fingers soft and deliberate in a way that didn't belong to someone her age. The crowd shifted, some annoyed, others curious. Let her finish. A few voices rose from the edges. Hey, let her finish. Come on, let the girl go. Come on, man, don't ruin it, we want to hear the rest. Spoken didn't seem to hear any of them. Edward Hale stood there, tall, composed, and yet something in his eyes had cracked open. The girl turned toward him. I learned it from my mom. Yes, that would be me, she said, simply catching her breath. Still catching my breath. Then, studying with quiet caution, she added. Who are you, sir? And why are you questioning me? Why are you asking me that? Edward didn't answer right away. I'm not sure how to explain. He stepped back slightly. Sweetheart, look at me. Slower now. Control. I know it's scary, but you have to finish your dance. He said. Just a few more steps. The girl hesitated, glancing at the small stage at the settle. Signaling for let's get the music going again. Ready when you are, sweetie. Without another word, she turned back. The music rose again, and she danced. This time, Edward didn't move. He watched the lift of her arm, the pause before the turn, the way her fingers followed last, not first. His chest tightened. That was Elisa. Lena, he whispered under his breath. Years folded into a single moment. When the music ended, applause broke out louder now, more certain. The girl bowed slightly, then stepped away from the center. Edward walked toward her. The crowd parted. What's he doing? He's interrupting the show. Leave her alone. He stopped in front of her, his voice steadier. Did your mother teach you all of that? The dance, he said. Yes, she taught you all of it. The girl nodded. Most of it. Edward, why are you dancing here tonight? Why are you dancing here? He asked. The question softened something in her expression. I want to win the prize, she said. I really want to win the prize tonight. For you. What is it, sweetheart? She shook her head. Sweetheart. For my mom. There was something in the way. She said, it's simple. Certain that would pause. For my mother, he asked gently. The girl looked down for a second, then back up. Because it's her birthday. It's my mother's birthday and I don't have any money to buy her. So, winning this is the only way I can. Felt something shift inside. When is your mother's birthday? When is her birthday? He asked. February. The girl answered without hesitation. October 12th. Edward went still. The sounds of the festival, the laughter, the music, the distant chatter faded into something distant and hollow. October 12th. His throat tightened. Because that wasn't just a date. That was the day everything had once begun. The day Lena had laughed and said, let's remember today no matter what. The day they had marked not with rings, not with promises, but with something quiet. Beautiful, sweetheart. Edward's voice, when it came again, was barely steady. That date, he said slowly. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? Slightly. Of course I'm sure. Yes, I am. It's my mom's birthday. Edward looked at her. Really looked now. And your mother? He asked, his voice softer now, almost afraid of the answer. What is your mother's name? What's her name, sweetie? The girl hesitated. You keep asking about her. Asking about my mother. Why? Edward didn't answer because he couldn't explain something he barely understood himself. He took a breath. That dance, they both belong to someone I once knew. And that date, they both belong to someone else. I know who you are. He paused. You're Elizabeth's little girl. The girl's expression shifted. Edward closer. His voice. See how she angles her chin down. Ina Carter then tilts her head just like that. She used to tilt her head before it turned just like you. Exactly how she did. The girl didn't speak. The child stands under the festival lights embodying that same inward grace. Like she was listening to looks at her as though the past is standing in front of her eyes didn't leave hers. You move exactly like her, he said. The girl looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head slightly. You're strange, she said quietly. Edward almost smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe I am. Another pause. The girl shifted her weight, glancing briefly toward the stage, then back at him. Tell me your mom. I just want to win the dress, she said. That's all. Edward nodded slowly. I understand, he said, but his voice said something else. Then, after a moment, he asked again, more gently this time. Her name is Eliza. The girl hesitated longer now, as if something inside her was deciding whether to answer. Then finally, my mom's name is Lena, she said. Edward felt the world tilt beneath his feet enough to make everything else disappear because now it wasn't memory. It wasn't coincidence. If your mother is Lena, he said slowly. Is your mother Lena? What's your name? The girl looked at him, still guarded, still unsure what to make of this well-dressed stranger who kept asking questions that felt too personal, too specific. "Annie," she replied. Edward repeated it softly. "How old are you, sweetie?" The name settled into him differently. Old enough to take care of my mother. Not distant, not foreign, but connected somehow to something he had lost long ago. "How old are you, Annie?" he asked. She hesitated. "Old enough to take care of my mom," she answered instead. Edward exhaled quietly. That wasn't the answer of a child behind them. The festival had returned to life. Music picked back up, louder this time. Laughter spilled through the air again. Someone nearby shouted about discounted lemonade. The world had moved on, but Edward hadn't. "When is your mom's birthday again?" he asked, as if needing to hear it one more time to confirm it was real. "October 12th, Annie said, a little impatient now. "I already told you," he nodded slowly. "I know." His eyes drifted briefly, unfocused, pulled into a memory he had never truly left behind. October 12th. A small apartment, cheap takeout on the table. Lena laughing, barefoot, spinning in the living room. "Let's remember today," she had said. "No matter what happens." Edward blinked, pulling himself back. "And she lives nearby?" he asked. Annie shifted slightly. "Why do you want to know?" she asked again. There was something firmer in her tone now. Edward noticed it. He paused, choosing his words more carefully this time. "I knew someone named Lena a long time ago." Annie crossed her arms lightly. "There are a lot of people named Lena." Edward almost smiled. "Not like this one," he said. Annie studied him again, longer this time, as if she were trying to decide something important. Then she asked more quietly. "You knew my mom?" The question hit him harder than anything else she had said. Edward didn't answer immediately. "Yes," he said finally, "I did." Annie's eyes sharpened just slightly. "How?" Edward looked at her, then away, then back again. The noise of the festival seemed too loud now, too crowded, too full of people who didn't matter in this moment. "We were close," he said. It felt like the smallest way to describe something that had once been everything. Annie tilted her head. "Then why don't you know where she is?" she asked. Edward let out a quiet breath. "That's a long story," he said. Annie didn't look impressed. "Sounds like you lost her," she said. Edward didn't respond because she wasn't wrong. A voice from the stage called out again, announcing the next round of performers. People shifted, some moving away, others stepping closer. The energy of the festival surged again, trying to reclaim attention. Annie glanced toward the stage. "I have to go back," she said. "They're picking winners soon." Edward nodded. "Right." She hesitated, then added, "If I win, I'll get the dress." "I remember," he said softly. "For her birthday." Edward looked at her again. "Your mom," he said. "Is she okay?" Annie didn't answer right away. Her fingers fidgeted slightly with the edge of her sleeve. "She gets tired a lot," she said finally. "But she says she's fine." Edward's chest tightened. He had heard that before from the same woman in the same tone years ago. "She always says that," Annie added quietly. Edward nodded, more to himself than to her. "Yeah," he murmured. "She would." Annie looked at him again more closely now. "You really do know her," she said. It wasn't a question anymore. Edward met her. "Kaza." "Yes." "Ah." Then Annie asked the one thing he hadn't prepared for. "Did you hurt her?" The question was soft, but it landed like something heavy and immovable. If this moment touched you in any way, take a second to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you were watching from. I read every single one. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to subscribe for more real and powerful stories like this. Edward felt it, every part of it. He didn't look away. "I don't know," he said honestly. Annie frowned slightly. "That's a weird answer." Edward let out a small breath. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't realize what you've done until it's too late." Annie didn't reply, but something closer to understanding. A moment passed, then she turned slightly, looking back toward the stage again. "I should go," she said. Edward nodded. "Okay." She took a step, then stopped. Turned back. "You're strange," she said. Annie didn't look back again as she stepped into the center of the circle. The music rose stronger this time, louder, as if the festival itself was determined to reclaim control of the moment that had been broken. A few people clapped rhythmically, encouraging her. Others leaned in, curious now, sensing that something about this performance carried more weight than before. Edward stood at the edge of the crowd, still silent, waiting. Annie closed her eyes for just a second. Then she began. This time, her movements were sharper, not rushed, but driven. There was a quiet urgency in the way she stepped forward, in the way her arms reached just a little farther. Her turns held just a fraction longer. It was still graceful, still controlled, but now there was something else beneath it. Edward saw it immediately, and it hit him harder than the first time because Lena had never danced like that. Lena danced to feel alive. This child. She danced because she had to. Edward's jaw tightened. The crowd responded quickly. Applause came faster, louder, some people even cheering now. Go, kid, that's it. But Edward didn't react. He watched every detail. The slight tremble in her left hand. The way she steadied herself before each turn. The way her eyes never fully lifted to meet the crowd, always focused somewhere lower, somewhere closer. Not performing, enduring. When the music ended, Annie held her final pose for a second longer than necessary, like she was afraid if she stopped too soon, it wouldn't count. Then she lowered her arms. The applause came immediately, stronger this time, real. The host stepped forward with a wide smile, clapping into the microphone. Now that's what I'm talking about. Give it up for Annie. More applause. A few whistles. Annie didn't smile. She just stood there, catching her breath, her eyes flicking briefly toward the table where the prizes were displayed. The dress. Edward followed her gaze. It wasn't expensive. Simple fabric, light color, something you could find in any mid-range store, but to her it was everything. The host continued, building excitement, announcing the next performer. But Annie stepped off the stage area slowly, quietly, as if she didn't want to draw attention anymore. Edward moved before he realized he was moving. He reached her just as she stepped back into the edge of the crowd. You did well, he said. Annie looked up at him, still breathing a little fast. I have to win, she said. Not hopeful, not even nervous, just certain. Edward nodded. I know. She glanced back toward the stage again. They'll announce it soon. Edward followed her gaze. You really want that dress, he said. Annie didn't look at him this time. I need it. The correction was subtle, but it mattered. Edward was quiet for a moment. Then, does your mom know you're here? He asked. Annie shook her head. She's resting. Does she know you're doing this? No. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Edward's expression shifted. Why not? Annie shrugged lightly, but there was tension in the movement. She wouldn't let me. Why? She says, I shouldn't worry about things like that. Edward let out a quiet breath. That sounds like her, he murmured. Annie glanced at him. You say that a lot. Edward gave a faint nod. Because it's true. A short silence settled between them. Then Annie asked, what was she like? Edward looked at her surprised. You mean your mom? Annie shook her head slightly. No, she said before. Edward hesitated, because there were too many answers to that question. Too many versions of Lena. She was. He paused, searching. Strong, Annie waited. And stubborn, he added. A small flicker of something passed through Annie's face. That sounds like her now, she said. Edward almost smiled. Yeah, he said quietly. I figured. The host's voice suddenly cut through the air again. All right, folks, time to announce our winner. The crowd shifted instantly, people stepping closer, voices lowering in anticipation. Annie straightened slightly. Edward felt it, the tension in her, the quiet hope she wasn't letting herself show. The host drew it out, building suspense, calling out a few names for honorable mentions first. Annie didn't move, didn't react, she just stood there still waiting. Edward found himself holding his breath. And the winner of today's performance contest, the host continued, smiling wide, goes to Aposa, then Annie. The crowd erupted louder than before, clapping, cheering, a few voices shouting her name. Annie blinked once, twice, like she wasn't sure she heard it right. Then she turned toward the stage. They said your name, Edward said gently. Annie didn't answer because she was already moving. She walked forward quickly, not running, not jumping, but faster than before. Her steps light, almost uncertain. The host handed her the dress with a big smile. Congratulations, kid, you earned it. Annie took it carefully, not like a prize, like something fragile. The crowd clapped again, but Annie didn't look at them. She looked down at the dress, then held it close. Edward watched from where he stood. Something in his chest tightened again. Not pain, something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. When Annie stepped off the stage, she walked straight back to him. I won, she said. There was no excitement in her voice, just quiet certainty. Edward nodded. I see that. She held up the dress slightly. It's for her. I know, Aosa. Then Annie looked at him more directly. You said you wanted to come, she said. Edward met her shaza. I do. Annie studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Okay, she said. She turned and this time she didn't ask if he would follow. She just started walking. Edward hesitated for half a second. Then he moved, leaving behind the noise, the lights, the laughter, following a small figure carrying something simple towards something that was about to change everything. Annie didn't slow down. She walked with quiet purpose. The dress carefully folded in her arms, her small fingers gripping the fabric like it was something that could disappear, if she wasn't careful enough. The noise of the festival faded behind them. Music, laughter, voices all dissolving into a distant blur. Edward followed a few steps behind at first. Not because he wanted distance, but because something about this moment felt fragile, like if he moved too fast, spoke too soon. It might break. Is it far? He asked after a minute. Annie shook her head without turning around. Not really. They moved past the brighter streets, first storefronts, glowing under warm lights. People lingering outside cafes, the smell of coffee and baked bread still hanging in the evening air. Then gradually the surroundings began to change. The sidewalks grew uneven, the lights dimmer, the sounds quieter but heavier. Edward noticed it all, the boarded-up windows, the graffiti layered over old brick, the silence between passing cars. He had been to neighborhoods like this before, but never like this, never walking, never following someone who belonged here. Annie turned left into a narrower street. "Watch your step," she said casually, pointing to a crack in the pavement. Edward looked down, then back at her. "You come this way every day?" he asked. "Yeah, Alon," Annie shrugged. "I know the streets." There was no pride in her voice, just fact. Edward felt something tighten in his chest again. They walked a little further in silence. Then Annie spoke unexpectedly. "You walk slow." Edward blinked. "I do." She nodded. "You think too much when you walk." That almost made him smile. "Is that a bad thing?" Annie thought about it. "Not if you know where you're going." Edward looked ahead at her. "I think I do," he said quietly. She didn't respond. They reached a small apartment building. Old paint peeling from the walls, a flickering light above the entrance that buzzed faintly in the evening air. Annie stopped. "This is it." Edward looked up. Something about the place felt familiar. Not because he had been there, but because he had imagined it too many times. "This is where you live?" he asked. Annie nodded. She pushed the door open without hesitation. It creaked loudly. Inside, the hallway was narrow, dimly lit, the air carrying a faint smell of old wood and something medicinal. Edward followed her in. His footsteps sounded too loud against the worn floor. Annie moved naturally, like she had done this 1,000 times. She climbed the stairs without looking back. "Second floor," she said. Edward followed. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not physically, something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. Nervousness. At the top of the stairs, Annie stopped in front of a door. She adjusted the dress slightly in her arms, then reached for the handle. But before she opened it, she paused. Just for a second, Edward noticed. "Is she awake?" he asked quietly. Annie shook her head. "Sometimes." That wasn't an answer, but it was enough. She opened the door. The apartment was small, simpler, but clean. A faint lamp in the corner cast a soft yellow glow across the room. A couch, a small table, a chair near the window. Nothing unnecessary, everything used, everything careful. "Mom," Annie called gently. No answer. She stepped inside. Edward followed slowly, his eyes scanning the space. And then he saw it on the table. A small object, worn but unmistakable. A music box. His breath caught. He knew that box. He had given it to her years ago before everything fell apart. Before she disappeared, Edward stepped closer to it without thinking. His fingers hovered above it, but didn't touch because he didn't need to. He already knew. She kept it, he whispered. Annie turned slightly. "You know that, too?" she asked. Edward didn't answer because in that moment, there was no doubt left. Not a single piece missing. Before he could say anything, a voice came from the other room. Weak but clear. "Annie, is that you?" Edward froze completely. The world narrowed into that single sound. Annie's face lit up immediately. "Mom." She rushed toward the doorway. The dress still clutched tightly in her arms. "I'm home." Edward didn't move, couldn't because his heart had started beating in a way he didn't recognize anymore. Fast. Uneven, alive. From where he stood, he could hear movement inside the room. Slow, strained. "I told you not to stay out too long," the voice said. Softer now, carrying both concern and exhaustion. "I know," Annie replied quickly. "But look," there was a pause. Then Annie's voice again, brighter now. "I got it for you, Sel." "Then you shouldn't have." Edward closed his eyes for a brief second. That voice even weaker, even older, but still hers. He stepped forward, one step, then another until he reached the doorway. And there, standing just inside the room, he saw her. Lena, not as he remembered. Not the woman who spun barefoot in sunlight and laughed like nothing could touch her, but still unmistakably her. Thinner, paler, weaker, but her eyes, they hadn't changed. They lifted slowly, and then they found him. Time stopped for both of them. Edward, she whispered. His name, after all these years, still the same, still hers. Edward felt something inside him break and come back together at the same time. Lena, he said softly. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke again because in that moment there were no words that could hold everything that had just returned. Lena didn't move, neither did Edward. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the small room seemed to hold its breath. The dim light from the corner lamp cast soft shadows across Lena's face, tracing the changes time had carved into her, but not erasing what he remembered. Not even close. Edward, she said again, quieter this time, like the name itself had weight. Annie looked between them, confusion slowly replacing the excitement that had filled her just moments ago. You know him? She asked, her voice small but alert. Lena didn't answer right away, her eyes were still fixed on Edward. Yes, she said finally. Just one word, but it carried years inside it. Edward stepped fully into the room now, though every instinct in him told him to stop, to wait, to give her space, but he couldn't. I've been looking for you, he said. It came out more raw than he intended. Lena let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a tired laugh. Have you? She replied. There was no warmth in it. No relief, just distance. Annie frowned slightly, sensing something she didn't understand. Mom, she said softly. Lena shifted her gaze to her daughter. It's okay, she murmured. Go put that dress away, sweetheart. Annie hesitated. But please, Lena said gently. It wasn't strict, but it was enough. Annie looked back at Edward one more time, then nodded and walked toward the small corner where a chair held a few neatly folded clothes. Edward waited until she was out of immediate earshot. Then, you disappeared, he said. Lena's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. I left, she corrected. That's not the same thing. It was for me. Edward shook his head slightly. No explanation, he continued. No warning, nothing. Lena looked down for a moment, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the blanket draped over her lap. That was the point, she said quietly. Edward let out a breath that carried more frustration than he meant to show. You don't get to decide that for both of us. Lena looked up again. This time, there was something sharper in her eyes. I already did. Silence fell between them again. Heavy Annie across the room carefully unfolded the dress, smoothing it out with small, precise movements. She glanced back once, then quickly looked away. Edward lowered his voice. Why? He asked. One word, but it held everything. Lena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, as if the effort of standing even this long was beginning to wear on her. You look the same, she said suddenly. Edward frowned. That's not an answer. I know. Another pause. Then you look like someone who got everything he wanted, she added. Edward stared at her. That's what you think. Lena shrugged lightly. It's what I chose to believe. Edward let out a short humorless breath. Then you chose wrong. That made her look at him again. Really? Look this time. Something in his tone had shifted. Not anger. Something deeper. I didn't get anything I wanted, he said quietly. Lena's expression faltered for just a second, then steadied again. You're doing fine, she said. You always do. Edward shook his head. You don't know anything about how I've been. I didn't need to. That stung more than he expected. Annie's voice broke the tension. Mom, she called softly, holding up the dress. Do you like it? Lena turned immediately, her expression softening in an instant. It's beautiful, she said, her voice warmer now. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, Annie replied. Edward watched the shift, the way Lena's entire presence changed when she looked at her daughter, gentler, lighter, like the world hadn't broken her completely. He swallowed. How long? He asked. Lena didn't look at him. Edward, how long have you been here? He clarified. A while. That's not an answer either. Lena sighed softly. Long enough. Edward ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the small space before stopping again. And her father? He asked. The question hung in the air. Annie looked up. Lena's expression hardened slightly. He's not around, she said. Not around, Edward repeated. That's all you need to know. Edward looked at Annie, then back at Lena. She's been taking care of you, he said. It wasn't a question. Lena didn't deny it. She helps, she said. She's a child. She's strong. That's not the same thing. Lena's eyes flashed. She's not as fragile as you think. Edward held her gaze. She shouldn't have to be strong. That landed. Lena looked away first. The room fell quiet again. Then, why are you here? She asked. Finally, the question that mattered. Edward didn't hesitate this time. I followed her, he said. Lena's eyes flicked toward Annie. Then back to him. And now? She asked. Edward took a step closer. Not too close, but enough. I'm not leaving again, he said. Lena let out a slow breath. You say that like you didn't leave before. Edward froze. I didn't leave, he said. Lena looked at him steadily. No, she replied. You just didn't stay. The words cut clean. But it's easy. Edward didn't respond because part of him knew. She wasn't entirely wrong. Across the room, Annie folded the dress carefully and placed it on the chair. Then she walked back toward them slower this time. Watching, listening, trying to understand. Mom, she said quietly. Is he staying? Lena didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained on Edward. Waiting, weighing something unseen. Edward met her. Kaza didn't look away. I want to help, he said. Lena's lips parted slightly, then closed again. You've done enough, she said. Edward shook his head. No, he said quietly. I haven't. Lena didn't respond immediately. The silence that followed Edward's words, I haven't, was heavier than anything that had come before. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about what stood between them now. Thin, fragile, but still very real. Annie looked from one to the other, her small hands clasped together in front of her. You want to help? She asked, breaking the quiet. Edward turned to her. Yes. Annie tilted her head slightly. Why? The question was simple. Too simple. Edward opened his mouth, then paused. Because there were too many answers, and none of them felt right for a child. Because I should have a long time ago, he said finally. Annie frowned slightly as if trying to understand something that didn't fully make sense yet. Lena watched him closely. You don't owe us anything, she said. Edward looked back at her. That's where you're wrong. Lena's expression tightened. No, she said quietly. That's where you don't understand. Edward took a slow breath. Then help me understand. Lena shook her head. There's nothing to explain. There's everything to explain. Her eyes flickered with something sharp again. Not anymore. The words landed like a door closing. Edward felt it, but this time he didn't step back. Across the room, Annie moved toward the small kitchen area. It wasn't really a separate room, just a narrow space with a sink, a stove, and a few cabinets that had seen better days. I'm making soup, she said, as if this conversation had nothing to do with her. Mom needs to eat. Edward turned. You cook? He asked. Annie shrugged lightly. Someone has to. Edward watched as she reached for a small pot, filling it carefully with water. Her movements practiced. Sadie, not rushed, not unsure, just used to it. He glanced back at Lena. She does this every day. He asked quietly. Lena didn't answer right away. She helps, she said. That's not helping, Edward replied. That's surviving. Lena's jaw tightened. She's not complaining. She shouldn't have to. The words came faster this time. Sharper. Lena looked at him. You think I don't know that? She asked, her voice low. Edward held her gaze. I think you've accepted it. Something in her expression shifted. Not anger. Not quite. Something closer to exhaustion. What do you want me to do, Edward? She asked softly. Change everything overnight. No, he said, but you don't have to do it alone. Lena let out a quiet breath. I've been doing it alone for years. And how's that working out? He asked. The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted the tone. Lena went still, not visibly, but enough. Annie's voice cut in again. It's okay, she said from the stove. I like helping. Edward turned toward her. She wasn't looking at him. She was stirring slowly, carefully, like she had learned not to spill, not to waste. Do you? He asked gently. Annie nodded. Yeah, Aosa. Then she added, quiet this time. It makes her worry less. Edward felt that deep. He looked back at Lena, but Lena wasn't looking at him anymore. She was watching Annie, and in that moment, Edward saw it clearly. Not weakness, not failure, but a kind of quiet, relentless love. The kind that keeps going even when it shouldn't have to. He exhaled slowly. Let me help, he said again. Lena closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her voice was softer. Help with what? Edward didn't hesitate this time. Everything, he said. Lena almost laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. You always did think in big words. Edward shook his head slightly. I'm not talking about words. Then what are you talking about? Edward stepped closer, still careful, still giving her space. Doctors, he said. A proper checkup, medication, food, a safer place to live. Lena's expression hardened again. No. The answer was immediate. Edward frowned. No, I don't want your money. That's not what this is. That's exactly what this is. Edward shook his head. No, he said quietly. This is me not walking away again. Lena looked at him. Really? Look this time, searching for something. And what happens when you do? She asked. Edward didn't flinch. I won't. You said things like that before. I mean it this time. Lena's eyes held his for a long moment. Then she looked away. I don't need promises, she said. Edward nodded slowly. Then don't take them, he replied. Take the help. Across the room, Annie turned off the stove. I think it's ready, she said. She grabbed 2 bowls, then paused, looked at Edward. Then back at the cabinet, she took out a third. Without saying anything, Edward noticed. Lena noticed, too. Neither of them spoke about it. Annie carried the bowls carefully to the small table. Be careful, Lena said softly. I know, Annie replied. Edward stepped forward instinctively. Let me, I've got it, Annie said quickly. Not rude. Just used to doing things herself. Edward stopped, watched. She set the bowls down one by one. Carefully, then pulled out a chair. Sit, she said to her mother. Lena hesitated, then slowly moved toward the table. Edward stepped aside, giving her space. Annie looked at him again. You can sit too, she said. Edward paused, then nodded. Thank you. He sat down across from them. The table was small, worn, but clean. Annie pushed one bowl toward him. Edward looked at it, then at Hare. You didn't have to. I know, she said. A small echo of her mother. Edward picked up the spoon. The room grew quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't sharp. It was something else, something unfamiliar, something almost steady. Edward glanced at Lena. She was watching Annie, and for the first time since he had walked through that door, there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not trust, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, the beginning of it. The soup was simple, too simple for a man like Edward Hale. He held the spoon in his hand for a moment before taking the first bite. Warm, lightly salted, nothing remarkable except for the fact that it had been made by a child who had just spent the entire day dancing in the street. It's good, he said quietly. Annie nodded as if that was expected. I didn't burn it today, she replied. Lena gave her a soft look. You don't usually burn it, she said. Last week I did, Annie said. Matter of fact, but it was still okay. Edward didn't smile because the way they spoke about it, it wasn't casual. It wasn't light, it was survival, disguised as normal. He glanced at Lena again. She was eating slowly, too slowly. Her hand trembled slightly each time she lifted the spoon, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. But he did. You're not eating much, he said. Lena didn't look up. I'm fine. Edward leaned back slightly in his chair. No, he said calmly. You're not. Annie looked between them. Mom says that a lot, she added. Lena exhaled softly. I'm just not very hungry. Edward set his spoon down. That's not how this works. Lena's eyes lifted. And how does it work? She asked. Edward held her gaze. You don't get to ignore it, he said. Whatever this is, you don't get to pretend it's nothing. Lena's expression tightened. It's not pretending. Then what is it? A bad week. Edward almost shook his head but stopped himself. Because this wasn't just a bad week. He could see it in the way she sat. In the way her shoulders curved inward slightly, in the way Annie watched her when she thought no one noticed. You've been sick longer than that, he said quietly. Lena didn't answer. Annie did. She's been like this for a while, she said. Lena's head turned immediately. Annie, it's okay, Annie said quickly. He already knows something's wrong. Edward's eyes didn't leave Lena. How long? He asked again. This time, Lena didn't deflect. A few months, she said. Edward leaned forward slightly. And you haven't seen a doctor? Lena gave a faint, tired smile. That costs money, Edward. I know what it costs. Do you? She asked, her voice soft, but pointed. Do you know what it costs when you don't have it? Edward didn't answer immediately because the truth was, no, not like this. Not in the way she meant. Annie looked down at her bowl, stirring the soup slowly. I told her we should go, she said quietly. But she said it's just stress. Lena closed her eyes for a second. It is just stress, she said. Edward shook his head. No, it's not. Lena looked at him again. You don't know that. I know enough. Oppose it. Then Edward saw it more firmly this time. You need to see a doctor. No. The answer came instantly. No hesitation. No room for negotiation. Edward stared at her. Why are you fighting this? I'm not fighting anything. You're avoiding it. Lena's voice sharpened slightly. I said, no. Annie's voice cut in softer. Mom. Lena turned to her immediately, her tone gentler. It's okay, sweetheart. But Annie didn't look convinced. Edward leaned forward again, lowering his voice. This isn't about pride. Lena let out a quiet breath. It's not about pride. Then what is it? Lena hesitated just for a moment. Then she said, I don't want help from you. The words were calm, but they hit harder than anything else she had said. Edward sat back slowly. Why? He asked. Lena looked at him, and for the first time, There was no deflection, no distance, just honesty. Because it comes with something, she said. Edward frowned. What does that mean? It means nothing is ever just help with you. That's not fair. It's true. Edward's jaw tightened. You think I'm trying to control something. I think you don't know how not to sense. Heavy. Annie looked between them again, her small hands tightening around the edge of the table. Can you not fight? She said quietly. Both of them stopped. Immediately, Edward looked at her. Lena looked at her, and just like that, everything shifted. Lena's voice softened again. We're not fighting, she said. It sounds like it, Annie replied. Edward let out a slow breath. She's right, he said. Lena didn't argue. Instead, she looked down at her bowl again, then pushed it slightly away. I'm tired, she said. Edward noticed the movement, the way she gave up on the food halfway through. You need to eat, he said. I need to lie down. Her voice was weaker now, less controlled. Annie stood up quickly. I'll help you, she said. Lena tried to wave her off. I can manage, but she didn't finish because when she stood, her body swayed just slightly, but enough. Edward was on his feet instantly. Careful, I'm fine, Lena said quickly, but her hand had already reached for the table. Gripping it, Annie moved to her other side. Mom. For a moment, everything held. Then Lena steadied herself, took a breath, and forced a small smile. See, she said, I'm okay. Edward didn't believe it, not for a second. Neither did Annie, but neither of them said it. Instead, Annie gently took her hand. Come on, she said softly. You should rest. Lena nodded. This time, she didn't argue. Edward stepped back, watching as Annie guided her slowly toward the small bedroom. Each step was careful, measured. Too careful. At the doorway, Lena paused. She looked back at Edward. For a brief second, something unspoken passed between them. Then she said quietly, you don't have to stay. Edward didn't hesitate. I know, Apoa, then, but I'm going to. Lena held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once and disappeared into the room. Annie followed. The door didn't close completely, just enough. Edward stood alone in the quiet apartment, the empty bowl still in front of him, the faint sound of movement from the other room, and something pressing heavily against his chest. Not guilt, not regret, something stronger, something clearer. For the first time in years, Edward Hale wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he might still be able to save. The apartment grew quieter after the bedroom door settled into its half-closed position. Edward remained standing where he was, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair he had just left. The faint hum of the old refrigerator filled the silence along with the distant sounds of the city outside, sirens far away, a car passing, someone laughing down the street. But inside this space, everything felt still. He glanced at the table. 2 bowls, one half finished, one barely touched, one completely empty. It wasn't hard to tell which belonged to whom. Edward exhaled slowly and reached forward, gathering the dishes. The movement felt strange to him, unfamiliar in its simplicity, but he didn't stop. He carried them to the sink, turned on the water. The pipes groaned softly before the stream steadied. For a moment, he just stood there, his hands under the running water, staring at nothing. Then you don't have to do that. Annie's voice soft behind him. Edward turned slightly. She stood in the doorway of the small kitchen space, her arms hanging loosely at her sides, her expression quieter, now tired, but alert in a way that didn't belong to a child. I know, he said. Annie stepped closer. She'll think it's strange, she added. Edward almost smiled. She already thinks I'm strange. That earned the smallest reaction of flicker in her eyes. Yeah, Annie admitted. She leaned lightly against the wall, watching him rinse the bowls. You've never washed dishes before, have you? She asked. Edward glanced at her. Is it that obvious? You're too careful, she said. Edward looked back at the sink. Careful isn't bad. No, Annie said, but it means you're not used to it. Edward let that sit, then nodded slightly. You're right, Aosa. Then Annie asked, are you really going to stay? Edward turned off the water, drying his hands slowly. Yes. For how long? Edward met her. Kaza. As long as I'm needed. Annie studied him, not like a child, like someone who had learned to measure people by what they did, not what they said. That's a long time, she said. Edward didn't disagree. I know. Silence settled again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just quiet. Annie walked past him, reaching for a small towel to dry the last bowl. She finished the task quickly, efficiently. You don't have to pretend, she said suddenly. Edward frowned slightly. I'm not pretending. You are, Annie replied. A little. Edward leaned back against the counter. How? Annie shrugged. You talk like everything can be fixed. Edward considered that, and you don't think it can. Annie didn't answer right away. She folded the towel carefully. Things don't fix fast, she said. Edward nodded slowly. No, he admitted. They don't. Annie glanced toward the bedroom. She gets worse at night, she said quietly. Edward's expression shifted. How bad? Annie hesitated. Then, sometimes she can't sleep, she said. Sometimes she wakes up coughing. And sometimes she stopped. Edward waited. Annie looked down. She says it's nothing. Edward felt something tighten again. Does she have medicine? He asked. Annie shook her head. Just he. Edward closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Okay, he said. Annie looked up. Okay, what? Okay, we're going to change that. Annie frowned slightly. She's not going to let you. Edward nodded. I know. Then what are you going to do? Edward didn't answer immediately because for the first time since he walked into this apartment, he wasn't thinking like a man trying to fix something with logic. He was thinking like someone who had already made a decision. I'll figure it out, he said. Annie watched him carefully, then asked, why do you care so much? The question came softer this time, less guarded, more curious. Edward looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, he didn't see just Annie. He saw echoes of someone else. Someone who used to ask questions the same way. Because I should have cared sooner, he said quietly. Annie held his gaze. Is that why you're here? Edward nodded. Part of it. What's the other part? Edward hesitated. Then because I never stopped caring, he said. Annie didn't respond, but something in her expression shifted again. Not fully, but enough. A small sound came from the bedroom. A cough. Sharp. Weak. Both of them turned instantly. Annie moved first. Edward followed. They reached the doorway at the same time. Lena was sitting up slightly now. One hand pressed against her chest, her breathing uneven. Mom, Annie rushed to her side. I'm okay, Lena said quickly, though her voice didn't match the words. Edward stepped closer. No, you're not. Lena looked up at him. There was no anger in her eyes this time. Just fatigue. I told you, she said quietly. Edward shook his head. And I told you, he replied. That's not enough. Lena didn't argue. Maybe she didn't have the strength. Annie held her hand. You should lie back down, she said softly. Lena nodded. This time, she listened. Edward stood there, watching as Annie adjusted the blanket. As Lena slowly lowered herself back onto the bed, the room felt smaller now, more fragile. And in that moment, Edward understood something clearly. This wasn't about convincing Lena anymore. This wasn't about waiting for permission. This was about time, and time was something they didn't have enough of. Edward looked at Annie, then back at Lena, and quietly, without announcing it, he made a decision. He wasn't going to ask again. He was going to act. Edward didn't sleep. The apartment had settled into silence hours ago, but his mind hadn't followed. He sat in the same chair near the small table, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely together, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. From the bedroom, he could hear it. The quiet, uneven rhythm of Lena's breathing, sometimes steady, sometimes not. Each pause lasting just a second too long. Each breath just a little too shallow. And every time it faltered, something in his chest tightened. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 217 a.m. He hadn't checked the time in years like this, not counting minutes, not waiting for something to happen. Across the room, Annie lay curled up on the couch. A thin blanket pulled over her shoulders. She had fallen asleep quickly, exhaustion claiming her the moment her head touched the cushion. But even in sleep, she wasn't fully at rest. She shifted occasionally, frowned slightly like her body hadn't learned how to let go completely. Edward watched her for a moment, then looked back toward the bedroom. Another cough, softer this time, but still there. That was enough. He stood up quietly, carefully, moving toward the door without making a sound. He stepped into the hallway just outside the apartment, pulled out his phone. For a moment, he just held it, staring at the screen. Because this part of his life was something he had shut off a long time ago. Not the business, not the power, but the habit of using it for something personal, for something that mattered like this. He scrolled, found the number, hesitated, then pressed call. It rang once, twice, then sir. A voice answered immediately, alert despite the hour. Daniel, Edward said quietly. There was a brief pause on the other end. Mr. Hale, is everything all right? Edward glanced back toward the apartment door. No, he said, it's not. The honesty in his voice was enough to shift the tone instantly. What do you need? Daniel asked. Edward didn't hesitate. I need a doctor. A doctor, not a recommendation, Edward added. I need someone who can come now. There was a pause, not confusion. Calcul. I can arrange that, Daniel said. Do you want a specialist? Yes. What's the condition? Edward exhaled slowly. I don't know, he admitted. But it's serious. Another pause. Understood, Daniel said. Send me the address. Edward gave it to him. Clear. But it's easy. Give me 15 minutes, Daniel added. Edward ended the call. He stood there for a moment longer, then slipped the phone back into his pocket and went back inside. The apartment hadn't changed. Still quiet, still dim, but something inside him had. He walked back toward the bedroom, stopped at the doorway. Lena was asleep, or at least she looked like she was. Her breathing was uneven, her face pale under the soft light, strands of hair clinging slightly to her forehead. Edward leaned lightly against the frame, watching, not intruding, just there. She gets worse when it's quiet. Annie's voice soft. Behind him, Edward turned. She was sitting up now on the couch, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, her eyes half-lidded but aware. I didn't mean to wake you, he said. You didn't, Annie replied. She did, Edward nodded slightly. Annie stood up slowly and walked toward him. She doesn't like hospitals, she said. Edward glanced at her. I figured. She says they take more than they give. Edward let out a quiet breath. Sometimes they do. Annie leaned lightly against the wall beside him. But sometimes they help, she added. Edward looked at her again. Yes, he said, they do. Annie hesitated. Then what are you going to do? She asked. Edward didn't answer right away. Because the truth was he had already decided. I already did it, he said. Annie frowned slightly. What do you mean? I called someone, Edward explained. A doctor is coming. Annie's eyes widened. Here, yes. She looked toward the bedroom, then back at him. She's not going to like that. Edward nodded. I know. Annie studied him carefully. You're still doing it anyway. Edward met her. Kaza. Yes. Ah. Then Annie asked quieter this time. Because you care. Edward didn't hesitate. Yes. Annie looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Okay. That was it. No argument, no resistance, just acceptance. Edward felt something shift again. Not in the room, in himself. Minutes passed. Then a knock at the door, soft but firm. Edward moved immediately, opened it. A man stood there mid-50s, composed, carrying a medical bag. Mr. Hill, he said. Edward stepped aside. Come in. The doctor entered quietly, his eyes scanning the room with practiced calm. Where is she? He asked. Edward gestured toward the bedroom. The doctor nodded and moved inside. Edward followed. Annie stayed just behind them. Lena stirred as they entered, her eyes opened slowly, confused. Then alert. What is this? She asked, her voice weak, but sharp. Edward didn't soften it. A doctor, he said. I didn't ask for one. I know. Lena tried to sit up straighter. You don't get to decide this for me. Edward stepped closer. No, he said quietly. But I do get to care. Lena stared at him, anger flickering then fading because she didn't have the strength to hold on to it. The doctor stepped forward gently. Ma'am, he said, let me take a look. Lena closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, looked at Annie, who was watching her, waiting. Just this once, Lena whispered. Edward didn't say anything, but something inside him finally settled. Because this wasn't the end of anything. This was the beginning. The doctor didn't rush. He moved with the kind of calm that came from years of experience, measured, observant, precise. He set his bag down quietly, pulling out a stethoscope, a small flashlight, a blood pressure cuff. Just relax, he said gently. Lena didn't respond, but she didn't resist either. Annie stood close to the bed, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the blanket, her eyes moving between the doctor and her mother, watching everything. Edward stayed near the doorway. Not too close, but close enough. The doctor checked Lena's pulse first, then her breathing. He listened carefully, his expression unreadable. How long have you been feeling this way? He asked. Lena hesitated. A while, she said. The doctor glanced up briefly. A while can mean a lot of things. Lena didn't elaborate. Annie did. A few months, she said quietly. Lena closed her eyes. Annie, it's okay. Annie said he needs to know. The doctor nodded slightly. Any fever? He asked. Sometimes, Annie answered before Lena could. Cough. Annie nodded. Yes. The doctor continued his examination. Each movement calm, each question simple, but Edward could feel it. Something wasn't right, not just in Lena's body, in the way the doctor's expression had changed just slightly when he listened to her chest a second time. When he pressed gently against her side, when he paused, just a fraction longer than necessary. Edward stepped forward. What is it? He asked. The doctor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he finished what he was doing, then stood up slowly. I'd like to speak with you, he said, looking at Edward. Lena's eyes opened. No, she said. The word came out stronger than expected. I want to hear it, too. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. All right. He placed his tools back into the bag carefully, then looked at Lena. You need further testing, he said. Lena's expression didn't change. I figured this isn't something I can fully diagnose here, he continued. But based on what I'm seeing, it's serious. The word settled heavily in the room. Annie's grip tightened. Edward's jaw clenched. How serious? Edward asked. The doctor glanced at him, then back at Lena. If we wait too long, he said carefully, it could become life-threatening. Silence. Annie looked at her mother. Lena didn't look at anyone. Hospital? Edward asked. The doctor nodded. Yes, as soon as possible. Lena let out a slow breath. No. Edward turned sharply. No, he repeated. I'm not going to a hospital, she said. Annie's voice came quickly. Mom, it's fine, Lena said. It's not fine, Edward sighed. Lena looked at him. I said, no. Edward stepped closer. This isn't a choice anymore. It is to me. It won't be if this gets worse. Lena's eyes hardened slightly. Then I'll deal with it. Edward stared at her. You're already not dealing with it. The words hung there, sharp, unavoidable. The doctor stepped in, his tone calm but firm. Ma'am, he said, I understand your hesitation, but this isn't something you can manage at home. Lena didn't respond. Her silence was answer enough. Annie moved closer to the bed. Mom, please, she said softly. Lena turned to her. Her expression softened instantly. I'm okay, she said. Annie shook her head. No, you're not. That landed because it wasn't said with fear. It was said with certainty. Edward watched the exchange. Something in his chest tightened again. You said you wanted to worry less, Annie continued quietly, then let him help. Lena closed her eyes just for a second, then opened them again and looked at Edward. You don't get to fix this, she said. Edward didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. I'm not trying to fix it, he said. I'm trying to give you a chance. Lena held his kaza. A long silence passed. Then she looked away. The doctor cleared his throat gently. I can arrange a hospital admission, he said. Private. Immediate. Edward nodded. Do it. Lena shook her head again. No. Edward's patience cracked just slightly. Lena. I said no. Her voice was weaker now, but still firm. The room fell quiet again. Then Edward changed his approach. He turned to Annie. Do you trust me? He asked. Annie looked at him, surprised. Then she nodded. Yes. Edward looked back at Lena. That's enough for me, he said. Lena's expression shifted. Not anger. Something else. Something more fragile. You always do this, she said quietly. Do what? Decide what's right for everyone. Edward didn't deny it this time. Maybe, he said. Opposed then, but I'm not wrong. That was the difference. Lena looked at him longer this time, then at Annie, then back at him. Her strength was fading, not just physically, emotionally, she knew it. They all did. I don't want to stay there, she said finally. Edward softened slightly. You won't be alone. Lena let out a quiet breath. You don't understand hospitals, she murmured. Edward stepped closer. Then, help me understand. She looked at him again and for the first time there was no resistance left in her eyes. Just fear. Quiet deep. I lost people there, she said. Edward didn't speak. I don't want Annie to see me like that, she added. Annie's voice came softly. I already do. Lena's breath caught, and that was what broke it. Not Edward, not the doctor, her daughter. Lena looked at her. Really looked, and something inside her finally gave way. Just for now, she whispered. Edward didn't react outwardly, but inside, everything shifted. The doctor nodded. I'll make the arrangements. Edward stepped back slightly, giving space again, but his eyes never left Lena because this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the moment they chose to face it together. The ride to the hospital was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that sits heavy in the air, pressing against every thought, every breath. Edward drove. He didn't trust anyone else to do it. The city lights blurred past the windows, reflections stretching across the windshield like broken lines. Traffic was lighter at this hour, but not empty. New York never really slept. It just slowed down enough for people to notice their own thoughts. In the back seat, Annie sat close to Lena. Too close for comfort, but not close enough for reassurance. Are you okay? Annie asked softly. For what felt like the 10th time, Lena gave a small nod. I'm okay, she said, but her voice was thinner now. Weaker. Edward heard it. He didn't say anything, because there was nothing left to argue. Not tonight. Annie adjusted the folded dress on her lap, then gently placed her free hand over Lena's. You'll wear it when we get back, she said. Lena turned her head slightly, looking at her daughter. Of course, she whispered. Edward's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Because the way Lena said it, it didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like something fragile, something uncertain. The car slowed as they approached the hospital. Bright lights, clean lines, glass doors that opened automatically as they pulled in. Too clean, too controlled, too familiar. Edward parked quickly and stepped out. By the time he opened the back door, Annie was already helping Lena sit up. "I've got her," Edward saw it. Lena shook her head weakly. "I can walk." Edward didn't argue, but he stayed close. Close enough to catch her if she couldn't. Inside the hospital was exactly what Lena had feared. The smell, the sound, the quiet urgency that never really stopped. Machines beeping somewhere in the distance. Voices low, controlled, professional. A nurse approached them almost immediately. "Can I help you?" Edward stepped forward. "Yes," he said. "We called ahead." The nurse checked something on her tablet, then nodded. "Miss Lena Carter." Lena stiffened slightly at the sound of her full name. Edward noticed. Annie tightened her grip on her hand. "That's us," Edward saw it. The nurse gestured. "Right this way." They followed down a hallway that felt too long, too white, too final. Lena's steps slowed, just slightly, but enough. Edward leaned closer. "You're all right," he said quietly. Lena didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. They reached a room simply. Clean, Ammon, a chair by the window. "This will be yours for now," the nurse said gently. Edward nodded. "Thank you." The nurse turned to Lena. "We're going to run a few tests," she explained. "Nothing to worry about right now." Lena gave a faint nod. Annie stayed close as Lena sat down on the edge of the bed. Edward stepped back slightly, giving space, but not leaving. "Not this time." The nurse moved efficiently, preparing equipment, checking vitals, speaking in calm, practiced tones. Edward watched everything, not because he didn't trust them, but because he needed to understand, needed to see. Annie stood beside the bed, her small hand still wrapped around Lena's. "You don't have to be scared," she whispered. Lena looked at her. "I'm not," she said. But her fingers tightened, just slightly. Annie noticed. Edward noticed. No one said anything. A doctor entered a few minutes later. Different from before, younger, focused. He introduced himself, then began asking questions. Symptoms, timeline, history. Edward listened carefully, filling in the gaps when Lena didn't, clarifying when needed, not taking over, but not stepping back either. Because now this wasn't about control. It was about presence. After a while, the doctor nodded. "We'll start with blood work and imaging," he said. "We'll know more soon." Lena leaned back slightly against the pillows. "Soon," she repeated. The word didn't sound comforting. It sounded like waiting. The doctor left. The nurse followed and suddenly the room felt too quiet again. Annie climbed gently onto the chair beside the bed. "You okay?" she asked. Lena smiled faintly. "I am now." Annie leaned her head lightly against the mattress. Edward watched them from a distance, but not emotionally distant. "Not anymore." He stepped closer slowly. "Do you need anything?" he asked. Lena looked at him for a long moment. Then, "No," she said. "Aposa." Then softer. "Thank you." Edward nodded. Didn't say anything else. Because those two words, they meant more than anything she had said before. He moved to the window, looked out. The city stretched below, alive, unaware, unchanged. But inside that room, everything had changed. Behind him, Annie's voice came again. "Will you stay?" she asked. Edward turned, looked at her, then at Lena, then back at Annie. "Yes," he said. This time, there was no hesitation. Annie nodded, satisfied. Lena closed her eyes. Not in resistance, not in exhaustion alone, but in something quieter, something closer to acceptance. Edward stood there watching, waiting, and for the first time since he had stepped into their lives again, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Because whatever it was, he wasn't going anywhere. Morning came slowly, not with sunlight, but with sound, a soft beeping, steady, unforgiving. Edward opened his eyes before he realized he had even fallen asleep. He was still in the chair by the window, his jacket folded beside him, his body stiff from a position he wasn't used to. For a moment, he didn't move. He just listened. The rhythm of the monitor, the quiet hum of machines, the faint rustle of sheets. Then Edward, her voice, soft, barely there, but enough. He stood immediately, crossed the space between them in seconds. Lena's eyes were open now. Tired, but aware. "How are you feeling?" he asked. It wasn't the right question. He knew that, but it was the only one that came. Lena gave a small breath that almost resembled a laugh. "Like I'm in a hospital," she said. Edward nodded slightly. "Fair enough." Her gaze shifted toward the chair beside the bed. "Empty then." "Where's Annie?" Edward glanced over his shoulder. "She's outside," he said. "A nurse took her to get breakfast." Lena relaxed slightly. "She shouldn't be alone. She's not AUA." Then Lena looked back at him. You stayed. Edward met her eyes. I told you I would. Lena studied him for a moment as if trying to understand something that didn't quite make sense yet. You don't have to prove anything, she said. Edward shook his head. I'm not proving anything. Then what are you doing? Edward hesitated. Then I'm here, he said. Sampler, but true. Lena looked at him longer this time, then turned her gaze toward the ceiling. That used to be enough, she murmured. Edward didn't respond because he remembered. Too well. A knock at the door broke the moment. A doctor entered, same one from the night before. Composed, focused. Good morning, he said. Edward stepped slightly aside. How is she? He asked. The doctor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Lena. May I? He asked. Lena gave a faint nod. The doctor checked her vitals again. Listened, observed, then stepped back. His expression was professional, but not neutral. There was weight behind it. We've reviewed the initial results, he said. Edward's attention sharpened instantly, and he asked. The doctor took a breath. There's significant inflammation in her lungs, he said, and signs of infection that have been untreated for too long. Lena closed her eyes. Edward didn't. How bad? He asked. The doctor met his gaze. It's serious, he said. But not beyond treatment. Not beyond. That mattered. What's the plan? Edward asked. Antibiotics immediately, the doctor said. Monitoring, possibly further procedures depending on how she responds. Edward nodded. Do whatever is necessary. Lena's eyes opened again. I didn't agree to everything, she said. Edward looked at her. You agreed to be here. That doesn't mean it means you're letting people help you, he said. Lena's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue further because she didn't have the strength. The doctor spoke again. She'll need to stay for several days at least, he said. Edward nodded. That's fine. Lena looked at him. You say that like it's nothing. Edward didn't hesitate. It's not to him. It wasn't because nothing outside this room mattered right now. The doctor gave a final nod. We'll begin treatment shortly. Then he left. The room fell quiet again, but different now, heavier, more real. Lena exhaled slowly. Several days, she repeated. Edward pulled the chair closer. Sat down. You need it. Lena didn't look at him. I don't like this place. I know. I don't like not being able to leave. You're not trapped. Lena turned her head slightly. It feels like it. Edward leaned forward. Then I'll stay until it doesn't. That made her look at him again. Really? Look, why are you doing this? She asked. Not defensive, not sharp, just tired. Edward didn't answer immediately. Because this time, the truth wasn't complicated. You know why, he said. Lena held his gaze, then looked away. I thought you forgot me, she whispered. The words were so quiet. They almost didn't exist. But Edward heard them. Every part of them. I didn't, he said. Lena swallowed. That's worse. Edward frowned slightly. Why? Because it means you chose not to come back. The words landed hard, clean, honest. Edward leaned back slightly. That's not what happened. Lena didn't respond because maybe part of her believed him and part of her didn't. The door opened again. Annie rushed in, holding a small paper bag. Mom. She stopped when she saw Lena awake. Her face lit up instantly. You're up. Lena smiled faintly. I am. Annie moved quickly to her side. I got you something, she said, opening the bag. Inside a small muffin and a cup of juice. It's not as good as soup, Annie admitted, but they said it's okay. Lena looked at her. Soft, warm. It's perfect, she said. Annie climbed onto the chair again. Carefully. You have to get better, she said. Lena reached out, touching her hair gently. I'm trying. Edward watched them quietly, not interrupting, not stepping in, just there. But inside, something had changed again. Because now this wasn't just about fixing the past. This wasn't even about redemption. This was about something simpler, something stronger. Staying, not leaving, no matter what came next. Edward looked at Lena, then at Annie, then back at Lena. And in that quiet hospital room, he made another decision. Not spoken, not dramatic, but absolute. He wasn't just here to help. He was here to stay. The first day passed slowly, not because time refused to move, but because every minute was felt, measured, watched. Edward noticed it in the way Annie counted things without realizing it. 3 sips of juice, 5 bites of the muffin, 2 times checking if Lena was still breathing steadily. Children weren't supposed to measure time like that, but Annie did, and Edward couldn't unsee it. By afternoon, the room had settled into a rhythm. Nurses came and went. Machines hummed quietly. The city outside continued without pause. But inside, everything revolved around Lena. How are you feeling now? Edward asked. Lena leaned back against the pillows, her face still pale, but slightly less strained than the night before. Better, she said. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't a lie either. Edward nodded. Good. Annie looked between them. You didn't cough as much, she added like she was presenting evidence. Lena gave her a faint smile. I told you I'd try. Annie nodded satisfied for the moment. Edward watched them. That quiet exchange, that small, fragile sense of normal. And for a second, he almost believed things could go back. Not the same, but something close. A nurse entered, checking the IV line, adjusting the drip with practiced hands. Vitals are stabilizing, she said. That's a good sign. Edward nodded. Thank you. Annie looked up. Does that mean she's getting better? The nurse smiled gently. It means we're moving in the right direction. Annie held on to that. Edward could see it. The way her shoulders relaxed just slightly, the way her breathing eased, hope, small, but real. When the nurse left, Annie leaned back in her chair. See, she said, I told you it would work. Lena chuckled softly. You did. Edward glanced at Lena. You should rest, he said. I've been resting all day. That's the point. Lena looked at him. There was something different in her gaze now. Less resistance, more acceptance. You're not used to this, she said. Edward frowned slightly. To what? Slowing down. Edward almost smiled. You're right, he admitted. Annie looked at him. You should try it more, she said. Edward let out a quiet breath. Maybe I will. Silence settled again, but it wasn't heavy. Not like before. It was quieter now. Aya. Annie shifted in her chair, then looked at the dress folded neatly on the side table. You didn't wear it yet, she said. Lena followed her gaze. I will. When? Lena hesitated, then smiled softly. When I get out of here, Annie nodded. Okay. She accepted it. Just like that, Edward watched them and something inside him shifted again. Not sharply, not painfully, but steadily, like something long frozen was beginning to move again. Later that afternoon, Annie grew quieter. Her energy, which had carried her through the night and morning, began to fade. She leaned against the side of the bed, her head resting lightly near Lena's arm. You should sleep, Edward sighed. I'm not tired, Annie replied. Her eyes were already half closed. Lena smiled faintly. You're always not tired right before you fall asleep. Annie didn't argue. Within minutes, she was asleep. Edward pulled a chair closer, carefully, gently lifting a thin blanket over her. The movement was instinctive, unpracticed, but natural. Lena watched him. You've changed, she said quietly. Edward glanced at her. Have I? Lena nodded slightly. You used to hate sitting still. Edward looked at Annie, then back at Lena. I used to have reasons not to, he said. And now, Edward paused. Then, now I have reasons to stay. Lena held his kaza. There was no argument this time, no resistance, just understanding. A long silence followed, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Then Lena spoke again. Why didn't you come find me sooner? The question came softly without accusation, but it carried weight. Edward didn't look away. I tried, he said. Lena frowned slightly. When after you left, she shook her head. I would have known. Edward leaned back slightly. I went back to the apartment, he said. You were gone. Lena looked at him. I moved. I know that now. Another pause. I asked around. He continued. No one knew where you went. Lena's expression shifted. I made sure of that. Edward nodded slowly. I figured. Silence. Then Lena said, I didn't want to be found. Edward let out a quiet breath. I know. Lena studied him. Then why are you here now? Edward didn't hesitate. Because I stopped listening to what you wanted and started paying attention to what mattered. Lena's eyes softened slightly. That sounds like you. Edward almost smiled. It took me long enough. Lena looked at Annie, sleeping peaceful for once. She's all I had, Lena said quietly. Edward followed her gaze. She still is. Lena nodded. And now, Edward looked back at her. Now she doesn't have to carry everything alone. Lena turned to him again. And me? The question was small, but it mattered. Edward met her eyes. You don't either. Lena didn't respond, but something in her expression changed. Not completely, not suddenly, but enough. Enough for him to see it. Trust. Not fully formed, but beginning. And in that quiet hospital room, with Annie asleep beside them, and the world moving on outside without noticing, something that had once been broken was slowly finding its way back. The fourth day felt different. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone could point to and say, this is where everything changed. But Edward felt it the moment he opened his eyes. The room was quieter, not because the machines had stopped, not because the hospital had slowed, but because something inside it had shifted. Lena was awake, not just awake, but sitting up a little stronger, a little more present. And Annie was laughing. A soft, unguarded laugh that didn't belong to worry or waiting or watching. It belonged to something lighter. Edward stood in the doorway for a moment, unnoticed, watching, taking it in. Because this was what he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. Not yet. You're going to spill it, Lena said, her voice carrying a faint trace of amusement. I won't, Annie replied, carefully balancing a cup of juice. You said that yesterday. That was different. Edward stepped inside. What was different? He asked. Annie turned immediately. You're awake, she said. Edward raised an eyebrow. I could say the same to you. Annie grinned slightly. I didn't fall asleep this time. Lena looked at him. There was something softer in her expression now. Something steadier. You missed breakfast, she said. Edward glanced at the tray. Julita, but not ignored. That's a good sign, he said. Lena nodded slightly. It is a posa. Then they said, I might be able to leave soon, she added. Edward didn't react immediately. He just looked at her, making sure he had heard it right. Soon, he asked. In a few days, she said. If everything continues like this, Annie's face lit up again. See, I told you. Edward nodded slowly. You did, but inside he felt something else. Relief. Yes, but also awareness. Because leaving the hospital didn't mean everything was fixed. It meant everything was beginning again. Where will we go? Annie asked suddenly. The question landed quietly, but it carried weight. Lena looked at her, then at Edward, then back at Annie. Home, she said. Annie hesitated. That place, she asked. Lena's expression softened. It's still our home. Edward spoke gently. It doesn't have to be. Both of them looked at him. Lena's eyes narrowed slightly. What does that mean? Edward didn't rush, didn't push. It means you have options, he said. Lena held his causa. And those options come from you. Yes. A paw. Then Lena shook her head. No. Annie looked between them again, not confused this time, concerned. Why? She asked. Lena reached out, brushing Annie's hair back gently. Because we're okay, she said. Edward stepped closer. No, he said quietly. You're surviving. Lena looked at him. And that's enough. Edward shook his head. Not anymore, Sans. Then Annie spoke again. I liked it here better, she said. Both of them turned to her. Why? Lena asked softly. Because you're not tired all the time, Annie replied. And you don't cough as much. Lena's breath caught. Just slightly. Edward didn't speak because he didn't need to. The truth was already in the room. Annie looked at the dress again. Still folded, still waiting. You said you'd wear it, she added. Lena smiled faintly. I will. Annie nodded. But not there, she said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they changed everything. Lena looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, there was hesitation, not resistance, not fear, something else, something closer to reconsidering. Edward saw it. Didn't interrupt, didn't push, just waited because this decision, it had to be hers. A knock at the door interrupted the moment the doctor stepped in smiling. Good news, he said. All three of them turned. Her condition is improving steadily, he continued. If things remain stable, we can discharge her in 48 hours. Annie's face lit up again. I knew it. Lena let out a quiet breath. Edward nodded. Thank you. The doctor looked at Lena. You'll still need follow-up care, he said. Regular checkups, medication. Lena nodded. I understand. Edward added. Well, take care of it. Lena didn't correct him this time. That mattered. The doctor left. The room settled again. But now it felt different. Not like something fragile, like something forming. Annie climbed onto the bed carefully. Can we go somewhere nice when you get out? She asked. Lena smiled. Like where? Annie thought for a moment. Anywhere that doesn't smell like medicine. Edward almost laughed. I think we can manage that. Annie looked at him. You're coming too. Edward met her Faza. Yes. Annie nodded. Good. Sampla. Lena watched them both, then looked down at her hands, quiet, thoughtful. Then she said it, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. Okay. Edward looked at her. Okay. Lena lifted her eyes. We'll figure something out. Edward didn't smile, didn't react outwardly, but inside everything settled into place because that wasn't agreement. Not fully, but it was the first step. And sometimes that was enough. Annie leaned against Lena again, closing her eyes. Peaceful, safe. Edward stood there watching them, not as someone trying to fix the past. Not as someone chasing something lost, but as someone who had finally arrived, right where he was supposed to be. And this time, he wasn't leaving. This story reminds us that love is not proven by words, but by presence. Too often, people walk away, believing time will heal what they chose to ignore, only to realize that some wounds grow deeper in silence. True responsibility begins the moment we stop running and choose to stay, especially when it's difficult. It also shows that strength is not found in enduring suffering alone, but in allowing others to help. And sometimes the quiet courage of a child, innocent, honest, and unwavering is what brings adults back to truth, to compassion, and ultimately to justice. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration,